The colony ship Wanderer hung in the darkness of space like a sleeping giant. Its metal hull was old and worn, covered with patches and repairs from decades of travel between the stars. Inside, 3,000 humans lived their lives, working and sleeping and dreaming of the day they would find a new home. Danny Cole sat alone in the observation deck, watching the stars drift past the thick window. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and hands that had seen too much work. His face was rough, marked by old scars that told stories he never shared with anyone. His eyes were dark brown, and they held a sadness that never quite went away. He had been a soldier once. He had fought in the war against the Empire, back when humanity first pushed into this part of the galaxy. He had seen friends die. He had killed enemies who were just following orders, same as him. When the war ended with no clear winner, Danny had signed up for the colony mission because he wanted to get as far away from Earth as possible. That was 15 years ago. Now he was 42 years old and he worked as a security officer on the Wanderer. It was quiet work mostly, breaking up fights between colonists who had too much to drink, checking cargo holds for stowaways, standing guard during supply runs to trading stations. He never talked about the war. He never talked about the nightmares that woke him up at 3 in the morning, soaked in sweat and reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. He just did his job and kept to himself, and that was enough. The door behind him slid open with a soft hiss. Danny didn't turn around. He already knew who it was from the sound of her footsteps. "Danny," said Captain Lisa Moore, "we need to talk." She walked over and stood beside him, looking out at the stars. Lisa was a small woman with short gray hair and sharp blue eyes. She had been captain of the Wanderer for 20 years, and she ran the ship like a tight family. Everyone respected her. Everyone trusted her. Danny trusted her too, as much as he trusted anyone. "What's going on?" he asked. Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a small data pad and handed it to him. On the screen was a map of the nearby star system, with a blinking red dot on one of the planets. "We picked up a distress signal about 6 hours ago," Lisa said. "It's coming from a survey vessel that crashed on 7. Danny felt his stomach tighten. 7 was deep inside territory claimed by the Empire. It was a jungle world, thick with alien plants and dangerous wildlife. They used it as a military outpost, and they shot down any ship that came too close without permission. "A survey vessel," Danny said. "What was it doing out there?" "We don't know. The signal is automated, just a basic emergency beacon. No voice communication, no details about what happened or who's on board." Lisa paused. "But the ship is registered to the Galactic Science Foundation. It's a research vessel, Danny. There might be civilians on board." Danny looked at the map again. The crashed ship was deep in the jungle, at least 50 kilometers from the nearest base. Getting there would be dangerous. Getting out would be even more dangerous. "You want me to go down there?" Danny said. It wasn't a question. Lisa nodded. "You're the best we have. You know how they operate. You know how to move through hostile territory without being seen. If anyone can pull this off, it's you." Danny was quiet for a long moment. He thought about saying no. He thought about all the reasons why this was a bad idea, why he should stay on the ship where it was safe. But then he thought about the people on that crashed vessel. Scientists, probably. Researchers who had dedicated their lives to learning about the universe. They were alone and scared, and they were waiting for someone to save them. Danny had spent too many years running away from who he used to be. Maybe it was time to remember. "Okay," he said, "I'll do it." Lisa smiled, but there was worry in her eyes. "Thank you, Danny. I know I'm asking a lot." "Just make sure the ship is ready to leave the moment I get back," Danny said. "They won't be happy when they find out we were in their space." "It will be ready," Lisa promised. "Be careful down there." Danny nodded and walked away, leaving the captain alone with the stars. The landing pod was old but reliable. Danny had used it a dozen times on supply runs and rescue missions, and it had never let him down. He strapped himself into the pilot seat and ran through the pre-flight checklist, making sure every system was working properly. His equipment was laid out beside him: a plasma rifle with 3 extra power cells, a combat knife with a blade that could cut through armor, a medical kit with bandages and painkillers and emergency stimulants, a portable scanner that could detect life signs from half a kilometer away. He wore his old combat suit, the same one he had used during the war. It was black and form-fitting, designed to absorb impacts and regulate body temperature. It wasn't as good as the armor they used, but it was light and flexible, and it let him move quickly and quietly. Danny took a deep breath and pressed the launch button. The landing pod detached from the Wanderer with a soft clunk, and then the engines fired, pushing him down toward the planet below. Seven grew larger in the viewport as he descended. It was a beautiful world, in a terrible kind of way. The surface was covered with thick purple forests that stretched from horizon to horizon. Rivers of dark water wound through the trees like veins, and mountains rose in the distance, their peaks hidden by clouds. But Danny knew what waited in those forests: predators with teeth like knives, plants that released poison when you touched them, and somewhere down there, soldiers who would kill him on sight. He angled the pod toward the crash site, using the distress beacon as a guide. The signal was weak but steady, coming from a valley near the base of one of the mountains. He set the pod to land in a clearing about 2 kilometers away, far enough to avoid detection but close enough to reach the crash site on foot. The descent was rough. The pod shook and rattled as it pushed through the atmosphere, and Danny gripped the armrests until his knuckles turned white. Fire streamed past the viewport, and for a moment he couldn't see anything except orange light. Then the flames faded, and he was gliding over the purple forest, the trees rushing past below him. He spotted the clearing up ahead and brought the pod down slowly, using the landing thrusters to soften the impact. The pod touched down with a gentle bump, and Danny let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He grabbed his equipment and stepped out into the alien world. The air was thick and humid, filled with strange smells that made his nose twitch. The forest surrounded him on all sides, the purple trees rising high above his head. Their leaves were broad and flat, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the ground was covered with a carpet of soft moss that muffled his footsteps. Danny checked his scanner. The distress beacon was to the north, about 2 kilometers away. There were no life signs nearby, but that didn't mean he was safe. They had stealth technology that could fool most sensors. He started walking, moving carefully through the forest, his rifle held ready. Every few steps he stopped and listened, checking for any sound that might indicate danger. The forest was full of noise: birds calling to each other in the canopy, insects buzzing around his head, the distant roar of something large moving through the underbrush. But no gunfire, no voices, no engines. So far, so good. The crash site came into view after about an hour of walking. The survey vessel had torn a long scar through the forest, knocking down trees and digging a trench in the ground. Debris was scattered everywhere, pieces of metal and glass and plastic that glittered in the dim light. The ship itself was a wreck. The front section was crumpled like a tin can, and the engines in the back were still smoking. One of the wings had been torn off completely, lying in the mud about 50 meters away. Danny approached slowly, his scanner held out in front of him. There was one life sign inside the wreckage. It was faint and weak, but it was there. Someone had survived. He moved toward the main cabin, stepping over broken pieces of hull plating and tangled wires. The door was jammed shut, twisted by the impact, but Danny found a gap in the metal that was just big enough to squeeze through. Inside, the cabin was dark and silent. Emergency lights flickered on the ceiling, casting red shadows across the walls. Seats had been torn from their mountings and thrown around the room. Papers and equipment were scattered across the floor. Danny followed the life sign to the back of the cabin, where a section of hull plating had collapsed. He grabbed the edge of the metal and pulled, his muscles straining with the effort. The plating groaned and shifted, then finally came free. Underneath, curled into a tight ball, was something Danny had never seen before. It was small, no bigger than a house cat. Its body was covered with scales that shimmered between silver and pale blue, catching the light like tiny mirrors. It had 4 legs ending in delicate claws, and a long tail that was wrapped around its body. 2 small wings were folded against its back, and its head was triangular, with a snout that tapered to a point. But it was the eyes that made Danny stop breathing. They were large and round, the color of molten gold, and they stared up at him with an expression of pure terror. A dragon, an actual dragon. Danny had heard stories about dragons when he was a child, fairy tales and legends from old Earth, about magnificent creatures that could fly and breathe fire and live for thousands of years. But those were just stories. Everyone knew dragons weren't real. Except this one was very real, and it was looking at him like he was going to hurt it. "Hey there," Danny said softly, kneeling down so he was at eye level with the creature. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon whimpered, a small sound that made Danny's heart ache. It was injured. One of its wings was bent at an unnatural angle, and there was blood matting the scales along its side. It must have been thrown around during the crash, just like everything else in the cabin. Danny holstered his rifle and held out his hand, palm up. "See, no weapons, I just want to help." The dragon stared at his hand for a long moment. Then, very slowly, it uncurled from its ball and stretched its neck forward, sniffing his fingers. Danny held perfectly still, barely breathing. The dragon's nose touched his palm, cool and slightly damp. It sniffed him again, and something seemed to shift in its golden eyes. The fear didn't go away completely, but it softened, replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. "That's right," Danny said. "We're friends now." He reached out carefully and scooped the dragon into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, just a few pounds of scales and bones and warmth. It trembled against his chest, but it didn't try to pull away. "I've got you," Danny said. "I've got you." He looked around the cabin one more time, searching for any other survivors, but his scanner showed nothing. The dragon was the only living thing on the ship. Danny didn't know why a research vessel was carrying a dragon. He didn't know where the creature had come from or what it was doing here. All he knew was that it was small and scared and hurt, and it needed his help. That was enough. He turned and started making his way back toward the gap in the hull, cradling the dragon against his chest. He had to get back to the landing pod, had to get off this planet before they found them. But as he stepped out of the wreckage, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Voices, voices, coming from the tree line to the east. Danny dropped to a crouch, pressing himself against the side of the crashed ship. The dragon seemed to sense his fear and went perfectly still in his arms, not even breathing. He peered around the edge of the hull and saw them. Soldiers, at least a dozen of them, moving through the forest in a standard patrol formation. They wore black armor that covered their bodies from head to toe, and they carried blue energy rifles that hummed with power. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and heads that were shaped like triangles. Their skin was pale gray, and their eyes were large and completely black, with no visible pupils or irises. They moved with a strange, jerky grace, like insects made of metal and flesh. Danny had fought them for years during the war. He knew how dangerous they were. Their weapons could burn through solid steel. Their armor could deflect most conventional bullets, and they never, ever gave up. If they saw him, they would hunt him until he was dead. He had to move, had to get away before they spotted him. Danny started crawling along the side of the crashed ship, keeping low and moving slowly. The dragon stayed quiet in his arms, its golden eyes wide and unblinking. He made it about 10 meters before one of the soldiers turned and looked directly at him. For a single heartbeat, they stared at each other. Danny saw his own reflection in those black, empty eyes. Then the soldier raised its rifle and shouted something in its clicking, chittering language. The forest exploded with gunfire. Danny ran. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it. His body just moved, muscles firing on pure instinct. He sprinted into the trees, plasma bolts screaming past his head, the dragon clutched against his chest. The purple leaves above him burst into flames as the weapons tore through them. Branches fell around him like rain, and the ground shook with the impacts of missed shots. Danny ducked and weaved, using the thick tree trunks as cover, trying to put as much distance between himself and the patrol as possible. But they were fast. They chased after him, their long legs eating up the ground, their rifles firing in steady bursts. Danny could hear them getting closer, their clicking voices growing louder. He wasn't going to make it. There were too many of them and they were too fast. Sooner or later, one of those plasma bolts was going to hit him, and then it would all be over. Danny burst out of the tree line and found himself in a small clearing. He spun around, looking for cover, for an escape route, for anything that might help. There was nothing, just open ground and purple trees and a dozen soldiers pouring out of the forest behind him. Danny turned his back to them. He dropped to his knees and curled his body around the dragon, shielding it completely with his own flesh. "It's okay," he said, his voice shaking. "I've got you, I've got you." The first plasma bolt hit him between the shoulder blades. The pain was unlike anything Danny had ever experienced. It was like being stabbed with a red-hot knife, like having acid poured directly onto his nerves. He screamed, but he didn't let go of the dragon. He held on, pressing the creature against his chest, protecting it with everything he had. Another bolt hit his shoulder. Another hit his lower back. Each one sent a fresh wave of agony through his body, but Danny refused to fall. He gritted his teeth and stayed on his knees, his body curved into a protective shell around the tiny dragon. The dragon looked up at him with those golden eyes, and Danny saw something change in its expression. The fear was still there, but there was something else now, something that looked like wonder, like awe, like gratitude. Then the dragon began to glow. Light poured from its scales, soft at first, then brighter and brighter until Danny couldn't see anything else. It wrapped around his body like a living thing, seeping into his skin, flowing through his veins. Danny expected more pain. He expected to burn. Instead, he felt warmth. It started in his chest, right where the dragon was pressed against him, and spread outward in gentle waves. It flowed down his arms and up his neck, into his face and down his legs. It filled every part of him, pushing out the pain, replacing it with something else. Something powerful. Danny looked down at his hands and watched as his skin began to change. Scales emerged from his flesh, silver and iridescent, shimmering with colors that had no name. They spread up his arms like a second skin, layering over each other in perfect patterns. They covered his hands, his wrists, his forearms, moving faster and faster until his entire arms were encased in gleaming armor. The plasma bolts kept coming, but now they bounced off his scales like raindrops off glass. Danny felt them hit, felt the impacts, but there was no pain, no burning, just a gentle pressure like someone was tapping him on the back. He stood up slowly, still holding the dragon against his chest. The glow faded, and he looked down at his body. He was covered in scales from the neck down. They caught the light and reflected it back in dazzling patterns, silver and blue and gold all mixed together. His hands had become claws, his fingers tipped with sharp points that looked like they could cut through steel. And he felt strong, stronger than he had ever felt in his life, like he could lift a mountain if he wanted to. They had stopped firing. They stood at the edge of the clearing, their black eyes wide, their weapons lowered. Danny could see their confusion, their fear. They had never seen anything like this before. Neither had he. Danny looked at the dragon in his arms. It chirped softly and pressed its head against his chin, making a low purring sound that vibrated through his transformed body. "What did you do to me?" Danny whispered. The dragon just blinked at him with those golden eyes, and somehow Danny understood. This was a gift, a bond, a connection between two souls that had been forged in the fire of sacrifice and love. He had protected the dragon, and now the dragon was protecting him. Danny turned to face the soldiers. There were 12 of them, all armed with weapons that couldn't hurt him anymore. He felt his lips curve into a smile, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just realized he was no longer the prey. "My turn," he said. He set the dragon down gently on a patch of moss and turned to face the enemy. The dragon stayed where he put it, watching him with those intelligent golden eyes. The commander shouted an order, and the soldiers raised their rifles again. They fired in unison, 12 plasma bolts streaking toward Danny in a blazing wave. Danny didn't dodge. He didn't need to. The bolts hit his scales and scattered like light through a prism, breaking apart into harmless sparks that faded before they touched the ground. Danny walked forward into the storm of gunfire, his clawed hands hanging at his sides. They kept firing, their weapons whining with the effort of continuous discharge, but nothing they did made any difference. Danny just kept walking, step after step, until he was standing right in front of the commander. The leader was taller than the others, with silver markings on its black armor that indicated rank. It stared at Danny with those empty black eyes, and for the first time, Danny saw something there that he recognized. Fear. Danny grabbed the commander's rifle and crushed it in his hand. The metal crumpled like paper, sparks flying from the broken components. He tossed the ruined weapon aside and looked into the commander's eyes. "Run," Danny said. The commander hesitated for just a moment. Then it turned and ran, its long legs carrying it into the purple forest. The other soldiers followed, abandoning their positions and fleeing into the trees. Danny watched them go. He could have chased them. He could have caught them and torn them apart with his new claws. But he didn't want to. He wasn't a killer anymore. He was a protector. He turned and walked back to the dragon, kneeling down beside it. The creature chirped happily and climbed up his arm, settling on his shoulder like it belonged there. "Okay," Danny said, his voice soft with wonder. "I guess we're doing this together." The dragon purred and nuzzled against his neck, and Danny felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hoping. He checked his scanner. The landing pod was still where he left it, about 2 kilometers to the south. The patrol was retreating to the northeast, moving fast and not looking back. If he hurried, he could make it to the pod before any reinforcements arrived. Danny started walking, his scaled feet leaving strange prints in the soft moss. The dragon rode on his shoulder, its tail wrapped around his neck for balance, its golden eyes scanning the forest for danger. They moved quickly through the purple trees, following the same path Danny had taken before. The forest was quieter now, the wildlife hiding from the sounds of battle. Even the insects had stopped buzzing, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the soft crunch of Danny's footsteps. He thought about what had happened, about the light and the warmth and the scales that had spread across his body. He thought about the bond he could feel between himself and the dragon, a connection that went deeper than words. He had so many questions. Where had the dragon come from? Why was it on that survey ship? What had happened to the rest of the crew? And most importantly, what was he going to do now? But those questions could wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting off this planet alive. The landing pod came into view through the trees, its battered hull gleaming in the dim light. Danny felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it. They were going to be okay. He opened the hatch and climbed inside. the dragon still perched on his shoulder. He strapped himself into the pilot seat and ran through the startup sequence, his clawed fingers moving awkwardly over the controls. The engines hummed to life, and the pod lifted off the ground, rising above the purple treetops. Danny angled toward the stars and pushed the throttle forward, watching the jungle planet shrink behind him. 7 faded into the distance, and the Wanderer appeared ahead, its familiar shape silhouetted against the blackness of space. Danny activated his communicator and sent a signal to the ship. "This is Sergeant Cole," he said. "I'm coming home." Captain Moore's voice crackled through the speaker, filled with relief. "Danny, thank God, we were starting to worry. Did you find any survivors?" Danny looked at the dragon on his shoulder. It blinked at him with those golden eyes and chirped softly. "Yeah," Danny said, "I found one." There was a pause, one survivor from a crew of 12. "It's complicated," Danny said. "I'll explain when I get there." He ended the transmission and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. His body still felt strange, covered in scales that caught the light and shimmered with alien colors. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt right, like this was what he was always meant to be. The dragon curled up on his lap and closed its eyes, its small body rising and falling with each breath. Danny reached down and stroked its head gently, feeling the smooth coolness of its scales beneath his clawed fingers. "I don't know what you are," Danny whispered. "I don't know why you chose me, but I promise I'm going to take care of you. Whatever happens, we're in this together." The dragon purred in its sleep, and Danny smiled. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel alone. The docking bay of the Wanderer was crowded when Danny's landing pod touched down. Word had spread through the ship that the sergeant had returned, and everyone wanted to see what he had found. Colonists pressed against the safety barriers, craning their necks for a better view. Security officers stood at attention, their hands resting on their weapons. Captain Moore waited at the front of the crowd, her blue eyes fixed on the pod's hatch. Beside her stood Dr. Helen Park, the ship's chief medical officer, with a medical kit in her hands and a worried expression on her face. The hatch opened with a hiss, and Danny stepped out. The crowd went silent. He looked different. That was the first thing everyone noticed. His skin had changed, covered with silver scales that caught the overhead lights and threw reflections across the docking bay. His eyes, once dark brown, now gleamed with a golden light that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. His hands were clawed, his fingers ending in sharp points that scraped against the metal floor as he walked. And on his shoulder sat a small dragon, its own scales shimmering in shades of silver and blue. Captain Moore stepped forward, her hand raised to stop the security officers from drawing their weapons. "Danny," she said, her voice calm but cautious. "What happened down there?" Danny stopped a few meters away from her, the dragon chirping softly on his shoulder. He could see the fear in the faces around him, the uncertainty. They were looking at him like he was a stranger, like he was something dangerous and unknown. He supposed they were right. "It's a long story," Danny said. His voice sounded different too, deeper and rougher, like stones grinding together. "But I'm still me, Captain. I'm still Danny Cole." Lisa studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his golden ones. Then she nodded slowly and lowered her hand. "All right," she said. "Let's get you to medical. Dr. Park will want to check you over, make sure you're healthy." She paused, glancing at the dragon. "Both of you." Danny nodded and followed her through the crowd. People stepped back as he passed, giving him a wide berth. He could hear them whispering to each other, their voices a mix of fear and curiosity. "Is that a dragon? What happened to his skin? Is he even human anymore?" Danny tried to ignore them. He knew they were scared. He knew he looked like a monster, but he was still the same person inside. He was still the man who had spent 15 years protecting this ship and the people on it. He just hoped they would give him a chance to prove it. The medical bay was quiet and sterile, filled with the soft hum of monitoring equipment. Dr. Park led Danny to an examination table and gestured for him to sit down. The dragon hopped from his shoulder to the table, curling up beside him and watching the doctor with curious eyes. Helen Park was a small woman with graying hair and gentle hands. She had been the ship's doctor for as long as Danny had been aboard, and she had treated him for everything from broken bones to plasma burns. She had never judged him, never asked questions about his past. She just did her job and treated everyone with the same quiet compassion. Now she approached him with her scanner, her expression professional but kind. "Let's see what we're dealing with," she said, running the device over his body. The scales appear to be some kind of organic material, similar to keratin but with a molecular structure I've never seen before. They're incredibly dense, probably capable of deflecting most small arms fire. Danny nodded. They stopped plasma bolts like they were nothing. Helen's eyebrows rose. "Impressive. What about your internal organs? Any pain or discomfort?" Danny shook his head. "I feel fine. Better than fine, actually. I feel stronger than I've ever been." Helen continued her examination, checking his vital signs and running various tests. The dragon watched her closely, its golden eyes following every movement she made. When she reached out to take a blood sample from Danny's arm, the creature let out a small growl. "It's okay," Danny said, stroking the dragon's head. "She's a friend." The dragon settled down, but it kept its eyes on the doctor, clearly ready to act if it sensed any threat. Helen drew the blood sample and placed it in an analyzer. While she waited for the results, she turned her attention to the dragon. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the creature. Danny looked at the dragon and somehow he knew what it was thinking. It was nervous but willing to trust him. If he said it was safe, it would believe him. "It's okay," Danny said again, this time to the dragon. "Let her take a look." The dragon chirped softly and stretched out on the table, allowing Helen to examine it. She ran her scanner over its body, her expression growing more and more amazed with each passing second. "This is incredible," she breathed. "The physiological complexity is off the charts. Its body temperature is significantly higher than any known reptile, suggesting an internal heat source. And these scales," she touched one gently, "they're conducting some kind of energy. It's faint, but it's there." "What kind of energy?" Danny asked. Helen shook her head. "I don't know. It doesn't match anything in our databases. It's like nothing I've ever seen before." The blood analyzer beeped, and Helen turned to check the results. Her eyes widened. "Danny," she said slowly, "your blood has changed." Danny felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Helen turned the screen so he could see it. The display showed two blood samples side by side. One was labeled with his name and an old date from a routine physical he had done last year. The other was the sample she had just taken. They looked completely different. The old sample was normal human blood, red and thick and unremarkable. The new sample was darker, with strange silver particles floating in it that caught the light like tiny stars. "Your red blood cell count has increased by 40%, Helen said. "Your white blood cells have developed new structures that I can't identify. And these silver particles, they appear to be some kind of metallic compound that's been integrated into your bloodstream." Danny stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Am I still human?" Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "You're still Danny Cole," she said. "You're still the man who has protected this ship for 15 years. Whatever changes have happened to your body, they haven't changed who you are inside." Danny looked down at his clawed hands at the scales that covered his skin. He thought about everything he had lost over the years, his friends, his family, his sense of purpose. And now he had been given something new, a bond with a creature that had saved his life, a power that he didn't understand but could feel pulsing through his veins. Maybe this was a second chance. Maybe this was his opportunity to become something more than he had been. The dragon crawled up his arm and settled on his shoulder again, pressing its head against his cheek. Danny reached up and stroked its neck, feeling the warmth of its body against his transformed skin. "Thank you," he said to the creature, "for trusting me." The dragon purred, and Danny felt a wave of emotion through their bond. Gratitude, affection, and something deeper, something that felt like family. Captain Moore entered the medical bay a few minutes later, her face tense with worry. She had changed out of her uniform and was wearing casual clothes, which meant she had been preparing to sleep before Danny's arrival interrupted her. "Report," she said, looking at Dr. Park. Helen gave her a summary of her findings, explaining the changes to Danny's body and the unusual properties of the dragon. The captain listened carefully, asking occasional questions, her expression growing more serious with each answer. When the doctor finished, Lisa turned to Danny. "Tell me everything that happened on that planet, from the beginning." Danny told her. He described the crash site, the wreckage of the survey vessel, the discovery of the dragon beneath the collapsed hull plating. He told her about the patrol, the ambush, the desperate choice he had made to shield the creature with his own body. And he told her about the transformation, the light, the warmth, the scales that had spread across his skin and turned him into something new. When he finished, the captain was silent for a long time. She paced back and forth across the medical bay, her arms crossed over her chest, her brow furrowed in thought. "They saw this," she said finally. "They saw you transform, saw their weapons fail against you." Danny nodded. "Yes. They'll report back to their superiors. They'll tell them about the dragon and about you." Lisa stopped packing and looked at him directly. "The Empire will come looking for you, Danny. They'll want to study you, to understand what you've become. They'll want to weaponize it if they can." Danny had already thought about this. He knew what they were capable of, knew how far they would go to acquire new military technology. He was a threat to them now, a variable they couldn't control. And so was the dragon. "I know," Danny said, "but I'm not going to let them take either of us. Whatever I am now, I'm going to use it to protect this ship and everyone on it." Lisa studied him for a moment, her blue eyes unreadable. Then she smiled, a small but genuine smile that softened the worry lines on her face. "I believe you," she said. "I've known you for 15 years, Danny. I've seen you put yourself in danger to protect others more times than I can count. Whatever changes you've gone through, you're still the same man I trust with my life." She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, right next to where the dragon was perched. "Welcome back, Sergeant Cole." Danny felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with his transformation. He had been afraid that the people on this ship would reject him, would see him as a monster or a threat. But Lisa was accepting him, just as she always had. Maybe the others would too. "Thank you, Captain," he said. Lisa nodded and stepped back. "Get some rest, both of you. We're going to have a lot of work to do in the coming days, and I need you at your best." She turned and walked out of the medical bay, leaving Danny alone with Dr. Park and the dragon. Helen finished her examination and gave him a clean bill of health, as much as she could given the unusual circumstances. She told him to come back if he experienced any symptoms she should know about, and she promised to continue studying his blood samples to learn more about the changes he had. Danny thanked her and left the medical bay, the dragon still riding on his shoulder. The corridors of the Wanderer were quieter now, most of the colonists having returned to their quarters to sleep. A few people passed him in the hallways, their eyes widening when they saw his transformed appearance, but no one said anything. He made his way to his own quarters, a small room near the security office. It wasn't much, just a bed and a desk and a tiny bathroom, but it was home. He had lived here for 15 years, and every corner held memories. Danny sat down on his bed, and the dragon hopped from his shoulder to the pillow beside him. It turned in a circle, like a cat preparing to sleep, and then curled up into a small ball, its tail wrapped around its nose. "You need a name," Danny said, watching the creature. "I can't just keep calling you Dragon." The dragon opened one golden eye and looked at him. Danny thought for a moment. He remembered the way the creature had glowed during the transformation, the light that had poured from its scales like fire made solid. "Ember," he said. "How about Ember?" The dragon chirped happily and closed its eye again, clearly pleased with the choice. Danny smiled and lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His body still felt strange, different in ways he couldn't quite describe, but it didn't feel wrong anymore. It felt like it was supposed to be this way, like he had been waiting his whole life to become what he was now. He thought about the future, about the dangers that lay ahead, that would come for them sooner or later. They would have to be ready. They would have to fight. But Danny wasn't afraid. For the first time in 15 years, he had something to fight for. He had Ember. He had the crew of the Wanderer. He had a purpose. And he was going to protect them, no matter what it cost him. With that thought in his mind, Danny closed his eyes and let himself drift into sleep. Beside him, Ember purred softly, her warmth spreading through the pillow and into his dreams. They were bonded now, human and dragon, two souls joined together by an act of sacrifice and love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And nothing in the universe would ever tear them apart.